Let's say a few words about the Grenfell disaster. Not so much about the findings of the report that was commissioned recently, because honestly I haven't looked at it in detail, so I can't really comment on that specifically in detail. But I just want to raise some general thoughts about the disaster and about some of the aftermath of it, so to speak. Grenfell was our worst fire in 30 years in this country, the worst fire since the Piper Alpha disaster of 1988, and the worst fire in London in centuries in peacetime. So this was a major disaster, and I think it's had the sort of impact on this generation around its survivors and the people involved with it as the Hillsborough disaster did in 1989. I think I'm making that analogy because both disasters seem to have the comparable sorts of a comparable level of bitterness about how it's been handled, about what's been found, about the consequences of it, although they're two very different disasters. One's in a football stadium, one's in a tower block. But both involved heavy loss of life, both involved serious questions about safety, about, I guess you could say every disaster does in some way. Today, Jacob Rees-Mogg was forced into an apology because on LBC he said that the common sense thing would be to ignore advice and leave the building. He's had to apologise for this because people connected with the disaster have found that to be insensitive and hurtful. I guess they take it to be sort of patronising and sort of almost victim blaming. Now, to be fair to Jacob Rees-Mogg, I really don't think that was his intention, and I don't particularly like Jacob Rees-Mogg. I don't share his politics, but I don't think he meant that as a callous comment. I think he was just saying what a lot of people, both looking at the disaster and probably people involved in the disaster themselves, have said and thought. That if the fire brigade told people to stay, then the common sense thing to do would be to leave. I think that with something like this, there is going to be sensitivities around it, but sensitivities, I mean, the most important thing is stopping something like this happening again. And if that means candid discussion on the issues involved, that might be needed. And it is unfortunate that people felt hurt by that, and I can hardly tell them how to feel, but I don't think that's what Jacob Rees-Mogg meant. Stormzy, the rapper, who always seems to pop up to have a go at the police or the government and stoke up divisions, has called for Jacob Rees-Mogg to resign over that. Strangely enough, he was quiet when Dame Lawrence, the mother of the teenager Stephen Lawrence, she actually insinuated that the London Fire Brigade were racist for telling people to stay put. She has apologised, but only after some pressure. Now, Stormzy has nothing to say about her. You know, does he not consider that those firefighters in the front line could well be dealing with post-traumatic stress, guilt, a whole range of feelings? And her comment was far more inflammatory, I would say, than Jacob Rees-Mogg's. So why is he not calling for her to resign? Could it be that she's a black woman and that wouldn't fit his narrative of the wicked white establishment putting down black people? I have no time for Stormzy. I think that he's an influential guy. You know, he's one of this country's, if not this country's, best known rapper. And what does he do? He vacuums all his anger at the establishment, and okay, that's always happened in music. But where's his condemnation? This may be going off on a tangent, but I'm talking about Stormzy. Why does he not offer the same sort of vilification at drill gangs terrorising the public, knifing young black Londoners, as he does offer the sort of vitriol towards the government? As far as I can see, Stormzy does nothing but stoke up animosity and division. And I know there is a place in art in expression for anger, but I don't see this guy contributing anything to society except bitterness, race baiting and division. I have no time for him. But, you know, with Grenfell, I think probably there were mistakes made by the fire brigade, and I don't think that's smearing them. I don't think it's disrespecting them. It's just they're human beings. People make mistakes, and they would say themselves that probably mistakes were made that night. But in their defence, this was an unparalleled situation. There had never been, at least not in recent years, a fire on that sort of scale in that sort of structure. They dealt with tower block fires before, for example the Camberwell fire, Le Canal House in 2009, which was serious enough. 6 people died in that tragedy, but nothing on this scale. So it was new ground, and I'm sure the fire brigade would be the first to admit that mistakes were made and things have to be learnt. But I also think that criticism should be balanced, because they were people on the front lines, and it seems unfair to criticise the first responders and not those responsible, for example designing the building, for carrying out safety checks and so on. So it's honestly collective responsibility. I think also those blaming solely the Tories, again, that's unfair. Just blaming Tory cuts, I think it's a factor, but as I understand it, Grenfell was built under a Labour council. So the truth is, no one person can be blamed for what happened at Grenfell. I think there is collective responsibility at stake. And because emotions are running so high around this, I remember the scenes when Theresa May visited there. It was very, very ugly, and emotions were running very, very high, understandably so. John McDonnell came in and just basically stoked up the tensions by calling it social murder. Now, I think as an opposition politician he is within his rights, and he has a responsibility in fact to call out what he believes to be negligence on the part of the Tories, but he also needs to acknowledge the role his party played in the Grenfell disaster. And for him to stoke up the flames of rage in the way he did was just borderline demagoguery. I think when a disaster happens, people, we always hear about health and safety regulations, but then, and I appreciate that sometimes there is maybe excessive paperwork, but if it's a choice between that and lives, I mean, the first question people ask when a disaster happens is, why wasn't the safety better? Why wasn't something done? So when we look at something like Grenfell, the issue there was cladding, among other issues, among other things that were brought up. So I think that when we hear health and safety being rubbish, let's just remember incidents, tragedies. Let's not call it an incident, a disaster like Grenfell. This is still raw in memory. This is only 2 years ago. So emotions are still 2.5 years ago. Emotions are still very raw about what happened, and I think that it's right that politicians should be cautious in the words. So Rees-Mogg, especially for such an eloquent man, a man who really does use vernacular prose in the way that he does, that was, badly judged. But I don't think he meant it in the callous way that some are portraying it to be. I really don't. And I think that people should also temper criticism of the fire brigade, but I don't think the fire brigade is entirely blameless. I mean, they did issue advice for people to stay put, and that may well have contributed to the high death toll. I don't think it's disrespecting the fire brigade to say that. I mean, anyone who sees the work these people do should have enormous respect for them, but as I understand it, it was a junior commander in charge that night. This was an unprecedented situation, so they made mistakes. They should learn from it, because they are the people in the front line. But that's also the point, they're the people in the front line. They deal with things most of us don't have to deal with. They see dead bodies, they see the consequences of these sort of disasters. So Doreen Lawrence, her comments were a complete disgrace. To try and insinuate it was racist. It's true that a lot of the victims were minority people, but there were white victims too, like the young Italian couple. So basically what I'm driving at is, anyone who is commenting on this needs to be responsible in the words that they're choosing, whether it be politicians, Or celebrities like Stormzy, you know, for him to stoke up the flames like that, when he turns a blind eye to what Doreen Lawrence is saying, just strikes me as hypocritical. Not surprising, but hypocritical. Because Jacob Rees-Mogg is a blue blood Tory, he just fits the enemy, you know. But I really don't think, and believe me, it's not often I defend Jacob Rees-Mogg. He represents a lot of things I deeply dislike about the Conservative Party, but on this occasion I really don't think he meant that in a callous way. I think he was just saying that in that sort of situation, a lot of people, and what he said was technically true, because there were survivors who did defy the fire brigade. I remember reports at the time, that's precisely what they said. So I don't see how telling the truth in that sense should be controversial. I guess it just came across as a little bit flippant the way he said it, like he was almost victim blaming, although I don't believe that was intention. And I think Stormzy probably knows that, but Stormzy's just stoking up the class war flames, which is pretty disgraceful considering the influence he has. Okay, I'll leave it there, but you know, health and safety, it may mean bureaucracy, but when disasters happen, the first question is, why wasn't something done? So lessons need to be learned from Grenfell. That's of no comfort to the victims. It won't bring back their family, but at least if it can have us, you know, produce some situation where nothing on this scale in a tower block happens again, that would be something.